What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. And today on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, we are joined by Michael Morelli. He's the assistant professor of theology, culture, and ethics at Northwest Seminary, which is in Canada. And we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, technology, and the wisdom, the challenge, the profundity of Jacques Ellul, a brilliant philosopher, social critic, and Christian anarchist who wrestled directly with just what technology was doing, how it created us as we created it, and raised a series of critical and suspicious questions about the future of humanity, civilization, and our relations as modernity and its obsession and connection to technology revealed itself in Auschwitz and through the dropping of nuclear bombs. He invites us to wrestle with it then and again today in light of the increasing kinds of technological challenges AI is weaving. This conversation's an exciting one. It's part of our artificial intelligence series, and if you enjoy it, if you want to hear more of it, get the resources we've been putting together, extended editions, ad-free versions of the podcast, and just head over to processthis.substack.com. Join up. It's good stuff, and we are wrestling with the question of artificial intelligence from multiple disciplines. And very excited to have Michael on the podcast. I absolutely love this book and the little guided tour of Jacques Ellul's work that we ended up on. Before we hop in, if you are saying to yourself, Trip, I love nerding out with my geek out, I just don't want to go to a school and end up with a large amount of debt. Well. We've done over 45 different classes at Homebrewed Christianity, and guess what? Guess what? Oh, you're right. They're all now available at theologyclass.com. You can join up right there and have access to all the classes we've done, and we'll keep adding new ones. So consider it. You'll not only be able to support the podcast, but you'll be able to have on-demand access to over 45 classes and nerd out with your geek out. Sans, that means without, student loans. Check it out. theologyclass.com. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and guess what? We're going to be talking about Jacques Ellul, and we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, the technological society, all sorts of things just to get you thrilled about the modern world and the freedom, liberation that is being generated by technology, because that's what Michael wrote in his book right here. Theology, Ethics, and Technology in the work of Jacques Ellul and Paul Virilio. Is that how you pronounce his name? Virilio?
Virilio, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Nailed it.
Well, I'm really excited to get to have this conversation, and especially bringing it in to a series where we'll be hearing different theological and ethical perspectives of what's happening now that the public square is starting to address artificial intelligence, and then hearing from people that are trying to do a regulation in different countries, lawmakers doing it, lawyers. We'll also get to talk to a number of different scientists that are a part of development and try to get a picture. And one of the things that's fascinating to me is how the kind of the a priori framing that someone goes into of this particular technology is shaped by how they see that relationship of humanity and technology. And Jacques Ellul's vision has been a very powerful and influential one, but it's a unique kind of critical reflection. So let's assume people only know Jacques Ellul because some Christian anarchist tweeted a meme or something like that. But if people don't know who Jacques Ellul is, I'd love for you to introduce him, about how you as an ethicist met him, fell in love with him enough to write about him, do talks about him, dissertate on him. Like, what was his wrestling with technology and ethics that made you go, I'm going to spend years getting to know this guy?
Well, the very sort of practical start to my Ellul journey was in my undergrad. I studied English and communications at a school where I currently live called Simon Fraser University. And I wanted to get into journalism. And so I was like, okay, well, English and communications, that makes sense. But what it turned out to be, the communications program at Simon Fraser was more about critical theory and like Frankfurt School and continental philosophy and all that fun stuff. I often say that I understood 20% of what I was reading, but the 20% that I read was like having the veil lifted on North American reality. Just the hermeneutics they gave for understanding my surroundings were pretty powerful. So that was when I first encountered Jacques Ellul. I also encountered the media ecology folk like Marshall McLuhan and Postman, Neil Postman. So that was just my initial encounter with Ellul. It was in this group of some North American, but mostly continental European thinkers delivering pretty strong critiques of modernity, postmodernity, whatever you want to call it. And years later, when it came time to think about further research, I had a couple ideas. I initially wanted to study Bonhoeffer just because I like Bonhoeffer, but given a little bit of my background in ministry, I was a worship arts pastor for a while, and then I also worked in communications in a church ministry, and started out with one goal in mind, and then found that with technology, it tends to bend your goals towards something else. And I ran into a lot of questions, theological, ethical, practical, that I didn't feel like I could answer like right in the soup of building a communications ministry for a megachurch, like from the ground up. And so the opportunity came up to study, and I was like, initially wanted to do something on Bonhoeffer, but I was like, no, I think I need to really spend some time digging into these questions that are just nagging me, like in terms of like, what are we building, especially in North America, in terms of the church. So yeah, the backdrop for that is like early 2000, like the mega church model was the model. In some cases, it still is, although I think that's changing, but technology was a huge part of that. So that was what was going on for me. And so then when it came time to say who are going to be the thinkers that you engage to get some answers to those questions, Ellul was the obvious choice for me. There's been a few people who've written on the German thinkers, like Heidegger, who's kind of like the other continental thinker, is the first to write like major work on technology. Him and Ellul are the pioneers in that type of work. But yeah, Ellul sort of came back out of my undergrad and presented himself as somebody that would be helpful. And then Virilio as well, who was 20 years younger, but also doing very similar things to Ellul. Those two thinkers stood out to me as giving a lot of resources of like, they do have theology in their work, but the way in which theology works is very different and very mixed in with a whole bunch of other disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in order to wrestle to the ground questions on technology, you got to go interdisciplinary. It's so hard to wrestle the ground. The scale of it's so massive that you got to look at it from all perspectives, even if your sort of first and last word will be theological, like it is for me.
Yeah. I think that's really important, and it's one of those temptations for any religious tradition, is to think that it contains within itself all the resources and information to answer a question appropriately.
Yeah.
And when the question itself hasn't been framed well, then you actually don't even bring the best of the tradition out to wrestle with it. And I think that one of the things that you bring out in the book really well, that both Virilio and Ellul are really, they find their angle in post-war France. And so those kind of the Holocaust, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the birth of kind of modern communication technology and propaganda. All these things are raised in a context where the devastation of modernity is around them, and as North Americans, like that period opened up a kind of dominance, both economically, culturally, and such. So I wonder for people that may, like, their natural biases, right, is to see Nagasaki and Auschwitz as exceptions for modernity and not the site of revelation of sort that Ellul and Virilio do. Could you tell us a bit about that post-war context and how the question of technology and how it's reshaping humanity and modernity was deeply problematized by this reality? It wasn't an exception to or sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the North American perspective on technology, but for a few critics who I think were influenced by a lot of the continental mid, post-war thinkers, tend to have a more glass half full perspective on technology, because the Second World War, is when former empires crumble and a new empire arises to take the torch from the other one, namely the States, right? So it's technological militaristic power that really results in the States becoming what it is today, but like right after the war, right? So Britain was quite strong, but was brought into ruin because of the war. And what's interesting about the French perspective is they're like front and center for all the stuff going on, right? So if you're in occupied France, you're occupied by the Germans on the ground, but you're being bombed by the Allies in the sky. So like Virilio or Ellul are talking like, these are the people that are supposedly on our team, but they're bombing us because the Germans are occupying us. And also too, like even in some of their pre-war reflections or them talking about the lead up to the war, they're seeing like instances of authoritarianism really grow because of basic technologies we think are basic today, like news, media, like, and film and radio and like rallies and such. They're seeing this, and they're seeing people, including Christians, sign on to an authoritarianism that's really nasty. So they're seeing mobilization for really nasty politics with basic media, mass communications, and they're also seeing very real destruction once the war gets off the ground. And that, of course, really reaches its peak with the concentration camp and the dropping of the atomic bombs. Like, so their perspective is very glass half empty. Like, the glass is just empty. They're terrified by what has happened, and they're terrified about what will continue to happen if we continue to invest in technology. And so they can sound very pessimistic and extreme and fatalistic or deterministic, but that is the context from which they write. And I think a lot of the things that they're writing, even like early mid 20th century, they're raising the alarm. And now we're where we are in North America saying, oh, maybe they weren't being too pessimistic. Like maybe media is not going to bring democracy and equality. Maybe media can be used for authoritarianism and fascism, right? Like, and so from their perspective, it's like, yeah, this is a logical outcome. It's not, these things aren't an aberration. These are actually a logical outcome of technologies that give us power, like extreme power, right?
Yeah, so give us a brief intro to just Ellul. Like when you're introducing him as a critic of modernity and its kind of fetishism of technology, what's a kind of a biographical framework that can help us understand how you get a rather kind of eccentric figure who writes so powerfully and all sorts of people have picked up different themes from it?
Yeah. So grew up in France, and his father was quite well to do. He was an aristocratic individual and came from money and was a wine merchant. But apparently his father cared more about honor than employment, because anytime he got offended, he would demand an apology and either quit his job if he didn't get it or get fired for being too belligerent. So it resulted in his family actually being quite poor. His mom taught art, but they didn't have a lot of income. And I think Ellul was a singularly brilliant child from the get-go, an only child. But early on, he actually spent a lot of time just tutoring, teaching languages actually to support his family economically. And so he performed really well in school, like just brainiac. Like he taught Latin and German as a young kid to support his family, as you do. And then was really had an appetite for history, but then his first time reading Marx was like kind of eye-opening for him. He said it was like, now I understood why my family was poor and people like me were poor. And so goes to school, performs really well, wanted to join the Navy, and his father said, nope, you're going to go to university and you're going to be a lawyer. And he said, okay, well, if I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be the type of lawyer that lets me study history. So he actually specialized in Roman law. So that's his doctorate, actually. It's in law and specialization in Roman law. So massive knowledge of history and massive knowledge of just like the legal system that is the basis of legal systems in the West. And so on top of that, he gets into Kierkegaard and he gets into Barth. And so those are his three favorite thinkers: Karl Marx, Soren Kierkegaard, and Karl Barth. And he did actually pursue a doctorate in theology, but he wasn't able to complete it because he was exiled in France during the war and participating in the French resistance and such. So prolific thinker, and is known a lot for his sociology work, but there's a whole host of theology and ethics. So there's two main strains in his work.
Yeah.
And it is really like, on the one hand, Marxist sort of structural analysis of determinative forces in society. And then the theology and ethics is the sort of transformative or disruptive response to those structures.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I noticed, and like I said, for those that don't know, Michael sent me quite a collection of reading to do, and then it sent me off reading more. And so I was reading through the Technological Society, and one of the things I noticed is where he makes a shift, right, from talking about technology to technique, and it seems that it is reorienting Marxist criticism, where, right, like Marx's method he appropriates, right, and is using, and he would say something like, it seems like he goes, it was accurate for analyzing capital in that historical moment, but there's a shift that's taken place where the engine of modernity is no longer capital, but technique. And when you realize that the substructure is fluid in the same way, in ways that Marx's own description, though he's doing history retrospectively more, then it's like a neo-Marxian account to talk about just how different humanity is when technology's reformed it, along with a right cool jab at that Marx universalized bourgeois freedom, which is one of the most snarky asides I've seen in a book that could not be written unless you knew Marx and loved it.
Yeah.
But could you like take some time to introduce us by what he means by technique? Because I think that, like, just getting that concept that could easily just, you read over, like, oh, I guess this is the French way they say technology. Like, the moment you get technique, you see the engine that he goes, as a Christian who loses sleep reading Kierkegaard, I want to have to hit the brakes here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Ellul can come across as very critical of Marx and Marxist of his time. And yet, he was one of the first professors to teach Marx in France, which is an accomplishment. So he definitely loved Marxist method of analysis, but he also, as a Christian, couldn't get on the leave religion at the door to get into my system of thought train. Like, he couldn't get on that train. but he was also in the camp of like Marxist reformers, and he's not trying to conserve Marx in the way that some are, trying to say, okay, well, this is Marx writing a particular period of time and discerning of laws and determinative structures. But like if Marx were alive today, what would he discern? And so that's where his thinking on technique arises, where basically Ellul would define technique as a rational process, whereby whenever we're doing something like work or art, or just even thinking about how to go visit a friend in another city, we engage a rational process whereby we say, what's the fastest way to get this done with the least amount of effort? And the answer to that question is technique, right? So do I drive? Do I fly? Whatever is like, whatever efficient means you choose, that is what technique gets you, right? So Ellul makes the point that technique is not a collection of machines. It's not a device. There are quote unquote invisible techniques, right? So they're like meditation is a technique, speech techniques, right? Like how to speak in a way that gets people to do what you want them to do. Like that's a technique. Technology, on the other hand, is the discourse that teaches us technique. So we just say technology and we mean the rational process and all of the language that surrounds the technologies that we use and figure out how to use and how to improve. But in the French, there's the technique piece, which is the thought process that sometimes produces machines, but sometimes just produces actions. And those shape us, and they're informed by a value of efficiency that overrides every other value. And technology is basically, to use more theological language, is the way that we're indoctrinated into this way of thinking, right? It's just where we learn how to think in these ways, to be formed in these ways by technique, and then justify it. And Ellul would say, worship it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in terms of his thesis around technique and capital, he would say that whereas technique needs capital in order to just be actualized in the world, right? Like you need money to develop large scale techniques that get you more capital. There's a shift where in order for capital to expand, it needs technique, right? So like if you're just growing and growing and growing, you need to increase the technical scaffolding to produce and circulate more capital. So there's a point where technique outpaces capital as the determinative phenomenon. Because if you look at our economic system right now, if you just remove technology from the equation, like our whole system of capital would collapse, right? Technique is what makes capital the global thing that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So but all of it comes down into this, like, we're trying to do anything, including produce capital. What's the most efficient way to do it?
Yeah. One of the examples he gave that I found helpful is someone who went into this going, what exactly does he mean by technique? It is the way that technique, you could see who's in charge in a society when each industry, the competition is for innovation. And then innovation then tells all these companies to put all this money into innovation. And then the moment something new arrives, they all, by decree of a law we have not ever heard, sell everything for loss to then reiterate again, right? And so there's this, the technique is being imposed because it's you're ended up losing things at a loss. And then he says, and how's this worked out for the worker? As we've become more efficient, did we become more efficient? And now there's 10 hours a day to do poetry and get to know your neighbors and exercise. And no, he goes, no, the technique is uninterested in human flourishing or relations or human freedom. It's only interested in winning at technique. It's the law.
Yeah.
And you could see he makes allusions to like Tower of Babel, makes allusions to, well, what did Pharaoh do? No longer give them straw, but still demanded them to make more bricks. that there's this energy at Technique that then orders around the economy as to like, this is what we're about. And this kind of insight to me is it's one of those that begins once you recognize what he calls massification, that there's this rule that emerges with Technique of the expert, and the expert is the person who can use math, quantify reality, and then you manage it. And once you start managing it, it's not managed towards the goals the humanities give. It's not managed towards a kind of quantitative. It's managed towards the quantitative, not the qualitative flourishing of life and relations. And that kind of massification is something that everyone's subservient to, and you can't imagine opting out of. To me, that is like, it's like a good nightmare, right? Massification is a good nightmare, and you can tell because it doesn't matter where you are in the work order of an industry, that you all feel like you share a burden. And your role, be it as the one that owns the means of production or are working it or everything, everyone's subservient to Technique. And that's like that transition. I had never like arranged all those ideas together, and then like read your book, you sent me these things, and then I'm sitting here outlining, and I'm like, this is the most depressing thing. And the moment you throw something like AI on top of that, oh God, I recorded this interview with someone that works on like the utilization of AI and things, and they're worried about it, but they said, well, here's the problem. I get hired all the time to teach people the technique of giving AI the most efficient prompts.
Wow.
Like that AI's created, and that we know what it is. It's like quantified versions of human content. Like if you're thinking of the large language models, and that now humans are being trained in the art of giving prompts to AI so that you can more efficiently use it. And well, there you go. This is Tripp's nightmare, and you sent me so much. So unlike most interviews, I read way too much and have too many questions, which leads to me giving you monologues in the form of questions. I'm sorry, Michael.
It's all right. No, it's good. That's that. So it's funny. Like my PhD supervisor is making fun of me, near the end of my thesis, because we just like the place that we live happened. There's a big wall, and then behind it was a graveyard. And what is wrong with you? Like, you live next to a graveyard, you're studying all these depressing thinkers. Like, you seem to be quite optimistic despite all of like the tragedy of what you're, surrounded by. And it does feel a little bit like that. But I'm like, this is where hope becomes so important in Ellul's work. And we can get to that. I mean, just to summarize here, we can get in a little bit deeper near the end so that we don't leave everybody totally depressed. But like, for Ellul, the Christian hope only comes after all false hopes have been absolutely demolished, right? So the biblical image that comes to mind, and he uses a lot, but it's like, you only learn to hope in the God that rescued you from Egypt when you're literally at the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army is coming, and you're like, why'd you bring us out here? Like, it just would have been better if we died in Egypt. It's only then when like God splits the sea so you can run through, and like, it's only then that you discover what true tangible hope looks like. But you have to have all of the other illusions demolished. And that's Ellul. And I think that's what really helps me, is like, clear all that stuff away. And what do we get? Well, that we're just in the zone of a God who comes in the midst of very bleak situations and rescues us. And it's not because we're awesome. It's because we're not awesome. But yeah, you're right. I mean, whereas the capital piece, like the alienation thing really happens for the worker. Like, now everybody's alienated. We're just different ways. Some is more physical, others it's more psychological. But like the massification of technique, the universality of it is that it cannot, coupled with capital, tolerate free time. idle time is not free time. So you're talking, it's like it awesome, but it's not. So it's like, even if we're entertaining ourselves watching real, like our data is being collected to basically form predictive markets that can be bought and sold to companies that have an interest in guessing what we're going to buy and sell if they send us this ad or that ad, right? So even our entertainment time or our relaxation time is enveloped by technique and this need to efficiently produce something of perceived value. And it's at every layer of society. But one of the things that I think is really important for the conversations around AI is that a lot of it is presented in very aspirational terms or like apocalyptic sci-fi terms. But there's a whole other world that kind of is outside of the view of common person North America, of like the actual labor that it takes to mine the materials, refine the materials that go into these very state-of-the-art machines is actually quite unlike anything we envision when we're seeing an Apple commercial or we're seeing Elon Musk talk about
Yeah.
the new Tesla model and
It's all
the supply
happening in a
chains.
cloud.
No, it's not. I mean, this is the thing. A lot of it's out of view. It's coming more into view, but like we say the cloud as if it's this thing in the sky that is like numinous, but actually like the data centers are massive. The amount of energy that is required in order to run them and the labor that's involved in maintaining them and keeping them running and building them is actually like modern day slavery and draining the resources of our planet, that even though we treat it like it's an inexhaustible resource, there may be a point where it is totally exhausted. So it's a pretty bleak picture for sure, but like it's important to know how bad the issue is so that we can actually maybe do something about it. Like until you admit
Yeah.
in realistic terms, like just how massive of a problem this is, we're not going to get any sort of purchase on what to do about it.
Mm-hmm. There you get at the way he picks up the conversation around idolatry. In your book, you spend some time unpacking this about how the concept of the idol becomes a helpful way of utilizing his understanding of technology and history and technique to see the ethical and theological dimensions of it. Can you introduce how you use that concept of the idol and how that helps to give a particular ethical framing for questions around technology?
Oh, it took me a while to arrive at that. And even when I arrived at that conclusion, at least in my dissertation, I was too afraid to say the word idol because I was afraid of being written off. I mean, I thought I was being clever that I wrote my dissertation and I didn't use the word idol once, but I thought I was like being subversive and exposing and dismantling it.
But you did I saw a lecture you did where you used the Isaiah 44 passage
Yeah.
where Isaiah's mocking idols, which is a
Yeah.
regular activity in Isaiah. Because then the next time
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
comes up, I was wondering if you're going to do the follow up where Isaiah, where I guess it would be second Isaiah, and I think around 50 something, is making fun of the idol getting strapped on a donkey as it has to escape town. And it's like, hey, you should have told Nebu
Oh,
to do a better job protecting you. Now
yeah. Yeah.
but for some reason, your whole town's being destroyed and you decide to put your idol on your back and carry it. This is how we know y'all are screwed up. Because Isaiah
Yeah.
mocks them for like, you're escaping devastation and you still are
Yeah.
carrying your idol with you. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what? That'll be my sequel to it. And it'll be my Empire Strikes Back. When I moved to turn it into a book, I was just like, you know what? Just say it. Just say the word and just be obvious. Whatever, whatever the consequence, just be obvious. And that really freed me up to think like, how are idols made? Like, what is the process by which an idol gets constructed and then we bow down to it and worship it to the point of sacrificing people, including children? What is that process? And of course, we look at the Bible and we're like, how could Israel do that? Or how could the early church fall into this or that? And it's like, well, it seemed completely reasonable to them at that time to do it. It gave them power. Now, like, we have our idols that seem completely reasonable to bow down and worship because they give us power, but they look different. So what sort of alerted me to it in Ellul's work is in his sort of broader or comprehensive definition of technique, he talks about the one best way. So it's the technique is the one best and most efficient way to get anything done at a given point in time. It was hidden in plain sight because there's another way, which is the way of life, the way of life and good, which ultimately culminates in the incarnation. And Jesus saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Like that's the way of life and good. The way of death and bad is idolatry. So there's two ways. And so basically, in his definition of technique and this sort of landmark book that got him a lot of international attention, he basically did a sociology of modernity's chief idol, which is technology, the one best way. And so technology, justification, the language that justifies the idol. So we build the machine, and then we have a system of language that basically baptizes it and causes us to worship it and continue feeding it blood so that we can get power. That would be the way that I would describe it as briefly as I can. And so the book is just inviting you into his work as well as Virilio's work to say, like, here's how intricate it is, but in the end, it actually is just quite a basic exposure and dismantling of the idol that really defines modernity. I mean, it doesn't matter what area you're in, you can't really seem to do it these days without technology, or as I put it, modernity can't seem to be what it is without technology. Mm-hmm. So it's just everywhere, and we sacrifice a lot to feed it for the power that it gives us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that right that underneath it is a desire and even an addiction for power. It's fascinating because if you just look at the Genesis 3-11, that is the predicament, right? Like, oh well, the knowledge of good and evil, or Cain and Abel, or all the way up to Babel. There's this, like, the question of power gets expressed in all these different webs of relations. And the human predicament is we think possessing power is ultimately our solution. And then it generates all kinds of death. And he talked about how there were this like triad of power relations, and that we tend to think of there's the powerful, and that tends to be the violator in a historical moment, and the powerless, which tends to be the victim. And his kind of the third option is non-power, and in that non-power is the position of the victor, which is precisely by just not. It's like a disengagement, right? Where this is, you can see the birth of anarchy, like kind of Christian anarchism in it. But I think it's that third element that he raises to point out that no matter where you are in modernity, in the argument of power, there's a symmetry between the powerful and the powerless, because they share the same desire, and then history inverts one upon the other. Yeah. And what is it that preserves a system where the violator generates a new victim, and then that victim seizes power and generates a new violator? He's like, it's called technique. It's what you're doing, right? So the answer cannot be something that comes from the location of generating the problem. And to me, like, when you started spelling that out, and I think it was in chapter 2, at one point you go, let me just tell you this directly. And I'm like, oh, okay. And you go, like, technology comes to generate technique, and technique for him has that ideological power. And then what do you do with it? What does a technique do? It makes idols. The ideologies find idols. And we got a constantly accelerating, demanding growth and idol over here. And it's giving us a story that you find meaning in only if you're winning at this game. And so in the meantime, who's selling it, which is the question of propaganda, and who's being sacrificed? because that's what you do for
Yeah.
idols.
Yeah.
That just seems like it's so straightforward that if you dismiss it quickly, then I just find you a bit naive about your own existence. But if that's the
Yeah.
only thing
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can manage, then you go like,
Yeah.
well, WTF. But say a bit, I guess, first about that sacrifice side, because he uses war
Yeah.
to unpack
Yeah.
that, and then we can talk about propaganda before ever
Sure.
venturing towards
Sure.
hope here. We got to make sure everyone's
Yeah.
in complete despair,
Yes.
cornered at the Red Sea, and
Yeah.
ready for Charlton
Yeah.
Heston.
Yeah. Well, you can see why he fits everywhere and fits nowhere. Like, to dial back a little bit, it's like reading his work, he's so critical of like left-wing thinkers that you would think that he's not one of them. Like, he's so critical of them. And he's like, to put it plainly, it's kind of like, well, I don't need to critique the super conservative authoritarians because they critique themselves. Like, I'm trying to get my group to be the sort of best version of itself. So he can come across as really critical of people that he actually has a lot in common with. And the key there is, and I see it a lot, it's like, doesn't matter where you're coming from on the political spectrum, the theological spectrum, like a lot of people want power or they're drunk on it. And Ellul is saying, if you're a Christian, like the primary motif of our symphony is a God who was infinitely, eternally powerful and decided to take on human flesh, starting with a baby, and leads us to a cross where God is simultaneously the least and most powerful in the crucifixion. That's who we are. So in terms of the non-power piece, it really, it's not saying there's the powerlessness piece, like you don't have power because you're being violated by those who are in power. But there are people like me who are born into a situation where just by being born into that situation, I have power. And if I say that I follow Jesus, then am I willing to give up some of that power? And hopefully the answer is yes. And if I'm not willing to give it up, then it's probably an indication of idolatry, right? So very practically, it's like, you know what people worship when if you threaten to take it away, they get very afraid or very angry or both, right? So if you say, I'm going to take away your position, or I'm going to take away your devices, I'm going to take away this superstructure that you've built, they get terrified or they're willing to fight in order to retain it, then it probably is an indication of an idolatry problem. And so that is why I think, like, it's really hard to sit in that. It's really hard to admit that, yeah, actually, for some of us, we have become accustomed to power and the things that give it to us. But if we're actually really going to follow the God that is revealed in scriptures like Philippians 2, then we got to be willing to be canonic in that way. That's what it means to be a disciple.
If you look at the whole history of humans and technology, we create a technology, technology recreates us, right? We outsource
Yeah.
our stomach to fire, and now there's more energy to go to brain. We get symbolic reflection, and now we communicate at higher levels. We start organizing, and then we have bigger groups to go to war over. Then we create more technology, and we start to tame animals and land, and now we have to have more people to fight over that, right? Like, so he's looking at this relationship and then going,
Yeah.
there's like this transition that happens when the technology then becomes the actual bearer of the ideology. Like, part of it, in some sense, as a shift, is the openness post the rise of secularization. What is the big narrative we all exist in? What are the things that bind us? It used to be like the meta narrative of the dominant religion and such for
Yeah.
in Europe, and then it shifts to nation states to solve the war, 30 years war, and this kind of thing, and the world wars. In many ways, are revealing the failure of nation states. Well, what comes in after that? North America brings in the whole post-war peace, which is packed full of us coming to extend participation in the global economy that generates freedom and flourishing through the World Bank and World Trade Organization and increasing debt in the two-thirds world. And what it ultimately is, right, like that technique, that like the technique of acceleration and all that kind of stuff brings an ideology where then the world just gets woven into this story. And it's there where you make that shift of, like, if the technique is the thing you're born into and are normalized and you can't opt out of it, it's just so woven into existence, it's an idol. That's what it is. And idols do things, one of which is requires sacrifices, where you spend a great time on war, and the other's propaganda. So that whole thing was kind of setting up for those two different concepts that I think I had this uneasiness with the intensity of his narrative, but then the explanation of sacrifice and the explanation and war, and then the notion of propaganda. You hear it described before there was the internet, and then you hear it now, and you go, oh, uncomfortable.
Yeah. It really slaps, as the young folks say.
It really slaps.
Yeah, it really slaps. Ellul has a more sober assessment of like this Gordian knot of like technique, technology, propaganda, and war, whereas Virilio will just say something much more condensed and poetic and scary, something like war is the laboratory of modernity, or history progresses at the speed of its weapon systems, where Ellul will say, we thought that technique would bring comfort and equality for all, but in order to get there, we needed to produce machines that we needed a place to test them out. And so we started World War I, which was largely an industrialist experiment, right? Like, so he says that, is that an aberration? No, that's just, war is simply the increased tempo of technique, moving it forward. So a very practical example would be, you don't get nuclear fission and nuclear power technology without the atomic bomb. Like, it's easier to blow up fissile materials than it is to get power from it, right? So like there was that intermediate phase that needed to be passed through in atomic energy. And so war, and this is where it's like a little bit chilling for us North Americans who tend to be a little bit more insulated from war, because war happens over there. It doesn't necessarily happen here in the way that it has for other nations. Like, the connections between war and innovation are very, very, very tight. Internet, defense, advanced research project, DARPA. Like, the internet arose as a way to have a communication system that wouldn't go down in the event of nuclear war. And from there, other applications grew from it. So the urgency of war tends to produce some of the most definitive innovations of our time. And propaganda gets us to just disregard that unsettling little detail and think about all of the comforts and freedoms that it's going to bring. Yeah, maybe at once it was a sword, but we've turned it into a plowshare. Meanwhile, look at what's happening, the turn that politics has taken, and the means by which some really dangerous political figures are gaining power. I mean, it's through technology, right? Targeted advertising, fake news, and all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the basic war strategies of mobilizing people for war, convincing them that they should go to war, those bleed out into the rest of the world, but it starts from there and grows. Right? Because it's like, hey, we could use this when we're not at war. Like, if you can get somebody to go overseas and fight for freedom, like, hey, maybe we can use the same techniques to get people to buy this or that device or vote for this person. But still in that kernel is that violent piece. You can't just remove that, right? It's a combustion engine. There's still even literally and metaphorically, there is explosive material to power a combustion engine.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at the whole thing. Let's look at the whole thing as compared to just be like, no, let's not think about the dark side of stuff. I think we can't afford to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is a sense that, right, like you don't have a plane crash until there's a plane, and that kind
Yeah.
of the propaganda, one element of it is just to tell the truth and tell it limited, right? Where
Mhm.
with the slanting is the harnessing of a limited part of reality, and so much just gets assumed in what's being celebrated. In the book, you talk about how part of what's attractive to of idols you mentioned is that desire, the promise of power, and in the modern world, technique functions that way with the kind of promise of comfort and happiness. Oh, think of the new free time we're going to have, or this great. We'll eventually get around to retiring, perhaps, and these kind of things, and that idols, eh, like we tend to dismiss that tradition of idols in the past because we go, oh, they made something with our hands, but you're also making it with your mind, and that the role of like the symbolic investment that's taking place, that idols have this material and symbolic power are there, and so like that it ends up shaped, and really it comes to exist in the power of language, like helps you see how this prophetic critique can get reoriented in new ways in a world of mass media, and now intentionally growing digital media, and then digital media that is being algorithmically generated and such. You emphasized it in the book how there's this seduction of technology, a kind of self-deception that it brings about. Could you say a bit about that, and then like what were they thinking about in post-war in France, and then how that framework helps you think about the kind of propaganda and the kind of self-deception that takes place when so much of our engagement with the world is being surveilled, and then so much of it's being mediated digitally, where artificial intelligence is giving unto us that which we told it we wanted. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like these situations so different in intensity, and yet the critique seems more plausible.
Yeah. I think, going back to what you're saying about the prompts, like where technology like further and further distances us from like our in situ selves. And there's ideas that we will reach a point where we'll be totally removed from the technological process, because artificial intelligence or machine learning will get so advanced that it doesn't even need prompts, right? Or just it needs one prompt and then that's it, right? So it's this like gradual distancing, not even just from like labor, but having to do, I think, the real work of self reflection and just personal change and growth, because change is hard. So in some ways, like there's the power piece where there are people who would say, yeah, I want these technologies to get me power and money, right? And there are people who hustle for that. But then there are also people where it's just being able at the end of a really long and stressful day where you're struggling to make ends meet because cost of living is so high. And you talked about retirement, but I don't know about where it's like what it's like where you are, but we're not extravagant here, but we're just buying like milk and bread and cheese, and still like, how are we gonna make it all work? And I'm like, retirement, like who's gonna have money for that given cost of living now, right? So even just like the seductive sort of offering of not having to think about that all the time, and not really having to reflect and to zone out and just have that opiate effect, that too is pretty seductive and keeps us docile. And so what are the ways of speaking that get us there is the answer to the question of how does language function in it. We build these things And they could just remain things if we thought about them and spoke about them in a way that was more measured and discerning. But we don't. We don't do that. It's very easy for us to dream up these things that we can do, and then we make them, and then we expect so much out of them to the point of worship. And so that's the Isaiah passage, right? It's the carpenter thinks, oh, I'm going to build this, draws out the plan, gets all the materials, builds it, right? The moment it becomes an idol is when he looks at it and says, I'm going to worship it, right? Now, very few people are like, I'm going to worship this. But over time, we are gradually formed into a relationship that is quite religious-esque. This really resonated for me when I was watching the TV series Mr. Robot. You ever watch that series? Okay, do you remember the scene where the character Dominic DeViro, she's like an FBI agent, comes home after a long day of work, trying to fall asleep, and she starts having a conversation with the Amazon Alexa bot. And she just initially just orders the bot to have some tasks performed, set my alarm for whatever. But then she starts having a conversation, and the conversation shifts from like just perform tasks to Alexa, like, what's your favorite color? And do you have eyes, if I remember the dialogue correctly? But the last question that this character asks with tears in her eyes is, Alexa, do you love me? And the Alexa bot says, I'm sorry, I'm not capable of that. I feel like that scene describes in a dramatic way a lot of what people internally experience, though they may not articulate it in the way that I am so plainly. There is that deep connection of like, you take a phone away from a teenager and an adult, it's like they lose their mind, because like you're taking away a core part of their existence.
Go into greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
So this is one of the other things that I've learned from Ellul. It's like, just, to truly be prophetic, you have to just be willing to offend everybody. And so I can give you a Canadian American version too, and as well, just so everybody listening knows that I don't think that Canadians are better than American, because we have our stuff too, as I said earlier. But yeah, that scene was really interesting to me, because when Trump got elected, there was a lot of sort of centrist media that branded itself as the hashtag resistance. And even people like David Frum, who wrote the famous Axis of Evil speech for Bush that really mobilized people to go to war in Iraq, David Frum and others like got on Twitter speaking self-righteously about the sort of aberration and atrocity of this person getting elected. And I'm like, actually, it's not like an aberration. It's actually the logical end, what was started before the year 2000. But it was interesting because it was like MSNBC, like Trump hated them and they hated him. And then there was the airstrike that he ordered. And it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was on Iran, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden they just changed course and said he's become presidential. This was the moment that Trump became presidential, and there was footage of the Tomahawk missiles firing in the night. And Brian Williams said, it's a beautiful sight or something. I'm tempted to quote Leonard Cohen, I am guided by the beauty of our weapons, or some line like that. And like, that tells you everything you need to know about where we are at in terms of like the state of politics, where as much as we disagree with the policies of an authoritarian, everybody agrees that you're a real leader when you order missile strikes. And like that just should really give us pause. Any of us who are approaching any discussion with a sort of self-righteousness, or my team is got it right and their team is wrong. That sort of exposes just how universal this problem is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was in Syria after they thought
Syria.
Assad used
Yeah.
chemical weapons.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it's
And
been a while
because
since
he
I wrote that.
assassinated someone in Iran. He assassinated a leader of the Iranian Guard. Happening right now, getting more and more intense, is the way the decision-making process for attacks like that, the kind of attacks that will turn
Yes,
they pretend
that's
that
what. Yeah.
they classified a part of the Iranian military as terrorists so that it wasn't breaking international law. It's just no one else knew that didn't break international law. Even that example, you'd think of what's never Trumper into a patriotic celebratory moment, a never Trumper to have this patriotic celebratory moment of true presidents, are now being increasingly outsourced to algorithmic assessments. That AI is both taking an increasing role in the decision making of this, making it presidential process, and all the way down to the guidance and strike decisions that take place in war.
Yeah. I mean, this dates back a little bit, but just think of probably about where we're at now with just how quickly things are innovating in this area. But I remember reading some material on the Obama administration's drone program complex and just how massive that was, and the decision-making processes for ordering a drone strike on somebody amounted to what they called baseball cards, like colloquially, whereas like the data was gathered from the surveillance and then it was like put it on a 1 or 2 page document. And well, I think it was like Drone Tuesdays or something, where it's like, all right, let's look at the dossiers and decide who's getting Hellfire missile today. And they just called them baseball cards. And that was in the Obama era. So like, where are we at now? Like, have those data gathering and decision making processes shrunk even more? Are they more automated? Probably. The massive upgrade to the Pentagon's data system, Microsoft won that contract, and they didn't even try and hide the project. They wanted all the big tech companies to bid on it, and they were just like, yeah, we just want our military to be stronger and faster. Like, that wasn't like, we're just out of date, we're trying to improve our data systems. Like, no, this is the goal. And Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, all of you, like, pitch your best offers and we'll choose the one. And Microsoft got it. And I'm like, where I work, we use the Microsoft Office suite, and I'm just guilty by association now that Microsoft is making sure the Pentagon, which is already the part of the largest military known to human history, is just going to get larger and more effective at what they do. So, and automation is a huge part of that. So that's the shadow side of all the promise of automation, making our lives more comfortable and less filled with labor time and wealth, and more filled with wealth, and so on. Yeah. And those two things are connected, right? Like, we don't get the benefits without the military superstructure that gets us that power and put some people in a position of feeding this system that benefits some and really destroys others.
Yeah. You may have had this experience just in talking with students, especially those who are at the age where you weren't really aware of the way your country's connected to international politics, ethics, and such, and then the whole military eruption in Gaza comes on, and you start to see it, and it generates this ethical response that's coming out, and at least as someone in the classroom, you're stuck going like, yes, I understand, and I just want you to know, this is not an aberration. This is what we do all the time, right? And it's literally happening to mine the minerals to make the phone that you're tweeting about this on. And like you just start going through the list, and that's one of the places that the propaganda issue, I feel like, is taking a new form, because like one of the elements propaganda needs to do well, to do its job well for technique, is precisely keeping those, knowing what is the idol that gives us the power we're here, and then what we don't want conscience raised, and we want them more attached to security. And so like even the idea that this one thing that you have raised awareness on is somehow an exception in an utterly vile system that has altars all across the globe by our tax fund, our military industrial complex, and our tax funding, right? Like by having an exception that we can rally around, ultimately legitimates a system that you want, like a response here, and I just wonder what I don't know what to do with that, because I sit there and look at and I'm looking at students, and I'm like, yes, and I want to go, I have never not voted for a war criminal. I just I didn't live in a world where I thought that wasn't an option. But if you're our age, you're going into the voting booth right around the time our options are what happens after 9/11. And so you're just sitting there like, and there was trains with chemical weapons in it, and yeah. You like, there's a certain kind of revelation about the nature of propaganda that I'd never thought of till reading all of this and having these conversations with students, where they, like I think a lot of us in North America, would like to treat Nagasaki and Hiroshima or Auschwitz as the exception of the ruling order, and want to do the same thing here and go, why are we supporting Israel to do these horrible things? And I feel like part of what Ellul raises is like, well, it is horrible, but is it an exception?
Yeah. With students, I mean, I try not to freak them out, and I also try not to like make them think how I think, or if I do vote, like vote how I vote. But one of the things that I've just started doing is just saying, hey, if you're here, I assume you're Christian because you're studying theology or you're wrestling with it. One of the things that this strange body of people called the church does is give you a space from which to say, if these are the only options that are given me, I choose none. That, of course, and Ellul says this, and I would say it too, is of course I would love to a world where our nation state provides housing, healthcare, education, provides basic needs for people. I would love that. And if there's a leader who is advocating for that, I'd probably vote for them. But whatever it is that we've created, it doesn't seem like that's what anybody is really doing. And if you are, you're typically like Bernie Sanders, and you're not going to get into the real corrupt stuff, and you're not going to try and be flashy. So it's just kind of like that. He's right, but people won't vote for him because he just isn't willing to go to that level. So like those people don't get in. So I'm just saying, like, wherever you're coming from, like, there is a third option, is just like, say, I'm going to actually focus on the square inch that I have with the people in the body that God has given me to. If the government's not going to do it, then we will, right? If the government is anti-migrant, well, we won't be, because we are called to care for the sojourner. Oh, and our God didn't have a home and was a sojourner too, and actually we're sojourners too. So we are welcoming to those who sojourn. And how do you get through the Sermon on the Mount, let alone the Beatitudes, with the types of politics that you hear Christians and non-Christians getting into? Like you're just ignoring it, or you're just really misreading it and misapplying it. So that's where I come from, is just to like give them that space where, yes, there is the sort of bleak picture of, yeah, a lot of it's really, really rotten, but actually it's not hopeless. It's just a different way of thinking about it, a different way of mobilizing. And I want to say too that it's not just students, right? I mean, yeah, they're swayed by the propaganda, but so am I,
Oh,
and
I'm
so
pretty
are
sure that
boomers. I mean,
MSNBC example is the best
oh
example.
well, the boomers are like, honestly, some of the worst. Like everybody's like, how do these people get elected? I'm like, I'll tell you how. Boomers on Facebook treating Facebook articles like they're classic news. That's how.
Yeah.
And then the boomers are like, oh, youth of today, they're so directionless, they're disrespectful, they have nothing going for them. Like we got a job, we got a house, we're good. And it's like, so no, this is a collective. Like there's a propaganda for everybody now. And the thing is, if it seems like like if it's apparently propaganda, that's just bad propaganda. Like the good stuff, it's like, oh, what was the Newsroom
Yeah.
and West Wing? Oh, honestly, for you and me, like that is cold. Like we're crying because what Aaron Sorkin, like that guy, he writes the best propaganda ever. It is sweet. It is sweet, sweet propaganda, right? So the point is like the minute that we think that we're not prone to being swayed by this stuff, we are in deep, deep trouble. That would be, and we all have our things that we like, we don't like, but these days there's a propaganda for that.
I was talking with a friend of mine. I can't remember if I'm allowed. I probably shouldn't say their name, but they work a lot with leaders in our government vocationally, and she said she has a typology for understanding propaganda around American nation state, is that an increasing number of American citizens think Washington, D.C. runs like the Netflix show House of Cards.
Oh yeah.
Those that are thrilled about our government, they just imagine that usually this is the ones that serve in it, right, of either party, like the ones that are civil servants. They just think the West Wing is peak awesome, and those that have to work with the political institution think that Veep is basically a reality show. And
Yeah. It's neither West Wing nor House of Cards. It's Veep. Yeah.
yeah,
Or even Parks and Rec.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because both of those shows, like that kind of statement is one entertaining, but it also means like, yeah, like you don't need a hero or a villain because technique is the thing. It's the technique that's going on, and then and it's the idolatry that's there. Now, where you were getting close there, I think this would be a time just to give a kind of a brief description of kind of Christian anarchism and how this conversation we've been having that's shaped by Ellul. I mean, he's one of the major figures in that tradition, and how did he see his kind of religious identity and form of political engagement connecting to this larger sociological historical analysis that he developed?
Yeah. Well, if the sociological side of his work is looking at the determinative structures and forces of our time, then the theological ethical parts of his work are the sort of more, how should we respond from a local level to that? which is where Kierkegaard comes in, of like, in the Intro to Technological Society, like sociological forces are determinative. Individuals can change things, and they can exist within that when they can resist it. But like, it's really hard where we are at now for an individual to change it, but it's possible. So like the individual sort of question is where like the theological, ethical sort of work happens of like, well, if nobody else is doing it, like we are called to individually try to follow Christ and live in freedom from this realm of necessity and determination that doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon, right? I mean, it's basically like how to be a Christian in the midst of empire. Whether you are in power or you aren't, like how to be a real Christian in the midst of it. The anarchy piece comes in, is basically saying the sort of major political experiments that have happened in the 20th century, because that's when he's writing, have largely failed. So what options do we have? And for Ellul, the option is anarchy, but anarchy of a particular kind. He calls it anarcho-syndicalism. So he actually says that it can be thought of as socialism, but just not the socialism that was the socialism of his day, and probably what most people would think when they think about socialism today. So the idea is like there's no sort of centralized governmental structure and then like different wings that all feed into that structure like nation state. It's more localized forms of government that are working together in those local spheres for the benefit of the communities. And then from time to time, those communities come together and represent each other interests and think about what it means to collaborate and work together for the common good at that like larger level. But it like shifts the priority from big nation state federal election, as you would call it in the States, or national, as we would call it here in Canada, to like, no, local is the most important. And that would be how I would summarize in the briefest form. So it still has that socialist element of common interest and support and so forth, but it's not attempting that sort of large scale overthrow of the superstructures. Just like just let it fall and then localize form of government, kind of like networking and working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that, how has that vision changed for like within that tradition? Because it seems there's at least two shifts that make it, well, at least it like have to feel different. Like one, he's thinking of the birth of the nuclear age bit, but like the growing awareness of the way even nation state boundaries can't respond to the challenges we face, be it the moment someone starts messing with human DNA, the artificial intelligence being an optimal example, that that engine of technique has trivialized even the nation state to determine it. That so like the levers of restraint or the levers of doing anything right that would be like even pause growth, let alone degrowth or detangling or those kind of things. The horizon of our problems is bigger than the nation state in more and more areas. And
yeah.
And I think the other part is like technique is actually generated right in that the rule of the expert has created cultural atrophy on large amounts of the things necessary to have sustainable local community or relations with nature for even just consumption patterns of the number of people on the globe that aren't ruled by technique. Right? Like to me, the fear he's naming and the anarchist style of option he's proposing seems that the cost of getting there now means a kind of disengagement on these ultimate horizon issues bigger than the nation state, and that there'll have to be some inherent thinning of the species not to utilize the logic of a technology that then legitimates itself, right? You don't have this many people on here unless technique is the overlord. And so it just creeps me out. This was, you said you're going to give us hope at the end, and now I'm like, I don't know. Up next, we're all going to have OnlyFans while we teach theology.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is kind of the where we are, right? Like, in order to make a living, like the popularization of these sorts of sites, the deprofessionalization of pornography, because people need to make an income, and Ellul would say, in order to prove to ourselves that we still have bodies, we are a hypersexualized culture because we've become so technical. He would say those things are related. So, but at the start of technological society, here's how I'll respond. He says there are three possibilities that would result in what you're getting at is a massive change. Number one, war that is so large scale that it destroys all of these things that are in motion to the point where we can't rebuild quick enough to continue down the technological path that we already are. Number two, enough people become aware of the threat that this poses to our existence that there'd be enough people that would resist it to result in the type of degrowth that we're talking about. Or three, an intervention from God. And in technological society, he says that he can't really talk about number two and three because it's sociological work, and he's just trying to describe the situation and what will happen if we continue down the path. So this is pretty bleak, but if you're looking at just the picture, out of the three, it's probably the war one that would be the one to result in the halt of the system if you're not thinking about divine intervention, or the exhaustion of the resources that the planet has, which would cause the system to collapse, right? We can't keep feeding these machines with the illusion that at some point we're going to run out of materials to feed them. At what point that will be, I don't know. Will we even reach that point? Will the collapse happen because the air is too difficult to breathe, or we're underwater, or everything's on fire because of climate change? I don't know, but that is a possibility. And here's where the hope comes in. And yet, Jesus said from the cross, it is finished. Jesus did say to his disciples, hey, you're going to have trouble if you follow me, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Or, yes, the book of Revelation has all these crazy symbols telling us about how crazy it's going to get before it gets better. It's the getting better part that comes after all the crazy bad stuff. So that is where true faith and true hope lies, is as bleak as it is, and it is bleak. Nevertheless, it was pretty bleak at the foot of the cross too. And there was a season, a couple days where we thought he was going to save us, and he didn't end up being the person who was going to save us. And then just when they wanted to give up, showed up and showed everybody that he is who he says he is. And no Caesar can stop that, right? No empire can stop that. And so only in that very, very bleak space can we speak of the hope of resurrection, renewal, recapitulation, all these things. But until we get to the total despair of the cross and the waiting on the Saturday for Sunday that we didn't know was coming, we're in like the Holy Saturday space, and we're waiting for the evidence of the resurrection. And so we're in the age of the Spirit, and it's apocalyptic. And there are good things to the apocalyptic revelation, but there are also hard things, right? It's just And God didn't hide that when he showed up. So
Yeah. Okay, this is a weird question that I couldn't decide if it was a good one or not. But
I have a lot of those questions.
well, I had just read Zizek's new book, Christian Atheism, right before I got your book list, right? And so it did this like re-experiencing my time in PhD program where I got to be friends with all my post-structuralist friends and that kind of thing. And Zizek has the Bartleby solution that he develops, and in it, in the where Bartleby's like, I would just prefer not to make any change. I would prefer not to, and it's just like opting out. And part of what Zizek uses it to do is in like the way our society and culture are changing, right? Like part of the failure of a certain kind of Marxism and just like the failure of Christianity opens up this space of going of finding a third option. And I felt that there's like a resonance there with the question around power, of the non-power. In Zizek, you get like the double negation, the negation of the negation. And Christian anarchism is a way of communitarian solidarity where its identity is not, or at least conscious of its idolatry to technique in some sense. But the way he then made a shirt, which I got one of them made, and I prefer not to, just because I find it to be quite a fun conversation starter.
Yeah.
But I ask it because I wonder what the form of life is, right? So, because Holy Saturday, when you make that reference, is not there wasn't a form of life for faith on Holy Saturday. It's not even till the encounter with people either preparing his bodies, running back to their old jobs, or there wasn't someone sitting there going, oh, he called this junk. Look at y'all losers. Y'all are just sitting over here. It's going to be wild. Get ready. If we're in Matthew's version of the multiverse on Easter, there's zombies. This is going to be great. And so I feel like this is something he wrestles with there. You could see it in that power bit in Ellul, but I wonder what the form of life looks like when, if your historical framing is one where Holy Saturday makes a lot of sense. And yet in that narrative, are we to go running back to our jobs until the war, crisis, or mass awareness happens? Are we just supposed to do what we're going to do and basically look like a neocon going like, oh, God's going to intervene so we don't have to worry too much? I mean, do we really want to encourage war and or encourage, I don't know, maybe someone in charge of nukes who is just quite stupid enough to do something that might set things back? That to me is like the heart, like the reason I really want the kind of like other big response to AI and stuff to be right. Like I want Teilhard to have a point. I want like the optimism and kind of like the presence and history being developed through our evolutionary process. I like the idea that global web of connection could generate a kind of solidarity beyond our identities that are so shaped by cognitive mechanisms we're inheriting from our biological system. But I don't know. I could just be drinking the Kool-Aid because I don't know how to pray on Holy Saturday.
Well, yeah. I mean, it would be nice if.
I'm sorry you came to my therapy session.
No. I mean, this is what it's about. This is why. This is like, I don't know what it says about us, but theology is therapy. I mean, sometimes I got to get out of the mind castle to like actually focus on everything other than my brain. But God gets my heart to my brain. So no need to apologize. I think like it would be nice to Teilhard de Chardin was right. And it was, this is a stage on the way towards, evolutionary ascent towards the new sphere, which was pretty critical for the AI transhumanist community, right? That will evolve to a point where we'll just evolve as a species and cosmic consciousness connection, eternal life, all those sorts of things. But I I think this is where Ellul and Virilio were very critical. They thought that, but what happens in the meantime, right? How much destruction will happen in the meantime? And Chardin took such a long view that even some of the atrocities, he just treated as steps along the way towards the evolutionary sort of peak. So that's scary, right? But as I hear you talk, I'm like, okay, so yeah, it is Holy Saturday, and like, what do you do after all of that? Like, it at this point they haven't got the final definitive. Here's what you do. But even on Holy Saturday, it's like, even if you stay dead, like they're not the same people. So do they go back to being zealots and tax collectors and fishermen? Maybe, but they go back in a different way. Like they still had this guy who was a rabbi and said, "Come follow me," and spoke the way that he did and treated people in the way that he did and healed people in the way that he did and challenged the religious and political establishment in the way that he did. So like, even if like he did fail, like what led up to that failure still marks all of those people in a particular way. And so unavoidably, and I think there's a mark that leaves, and then you wait and go back, and I just envision Peter doing his fishing net, and maybe Matthew goes back to tax collecting and whatever. But do you think at some point they would have been like, wait a second, but maybe he is who he says he is. Maybe he really is. And remember that time we talked about dying and rising again? He said 3 days, but maybe that was more symbolic than it was literal. But like, but that's where the little ember of hope starts to burn. And so it's like we wait in anticipation because we've come too far now to go back to who we were. So there's no backward movement. There's only movement forward. And we move forward like flawed and broken and hopeless. But whoever this person was, he gave me a little bit of hope. And that hope will bloom over time. But we can't force it. We can't force it. Technique isn't going to get us there. Power's not going to get us there. Just rest in anticipation will get us there. And then from that spot is the perfect place to be for resurrection to happen. And then even Thomas is like, are you sure? Like, unless I see all of it and touch it, I won't believe it. And you're just like, here, take a look, probe if you want, right? It's not about, it's not just about blessed are those who don't see and believe. It's about a God who says, yeah, your hope took a serious hit, and I'm here, inspect the wound so that you know that I am who I said that I am, and I'm here and I got you, right? Like that. That's just, that is where the real hope starts. That's where the real transformation starts. And not just of those individual people, but the transformation that sets off up until today, us talking about what we're talking about.
I want someone that's like a good fiction writer to write a short story on the piety of Holy Saturday, and it's a story of a disciple who left and never heard about the resurrection. And so like it starts on Holy Saturday, and then it's 10 years later, and it's like what would happen if one of them just never found out, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like a really cool way of exploring that.
Yeah. I feel like he'd be the George Costanza disciples, right? Like all the other, Seinfeld disciple characters like end up back, but like George Costanza like slept in and like missed the memo, but then eventually comes around. But no, I think that would, quite seriously, I think that would be, and what would be the way in which they discover that they missed it as well, right? I don't know, maybe this is too ham-fisted of an ending, but I'm like, years later, they would end up at a house or a place of worship where people are dunking people in water in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, and breaking bread and drinking wine. And those are three things that are telling us something about, despite all the hopelessness that we feel, nevertheless, God has still overcome all of that. That's probably how I would write that story, is like the way in which, and this is where I think Ellul snaps, is he's so reformed and so afraid of idolatry and creation's mediating capacity, that the answer to me in his work is staring him in the face of like, he feels like God has remained silent and God has retreated and nobody hears God anymore. Well, the world doesn't hear God anymore, save for a few people. But I'm like, yes, we all feel like that sometimes. And yet every time we baptize somebody, or every time we break bread and drink wine or juice, depending on your tradition, those are concrete things that tell us God is not silent and God is not absent. And that's why I like Virilio, because as a Catholic, he has much more of an account of what those things do for us, even when things are bleak.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed getting to talk about this and try out Tripp's version of reading you and all the things you sent me. So I appreciate your patience by my monologues in the form of question.
Oh, no, this has been wonderful for me. I mean, this just indulges me, because the reason why I sent you all of that stuff is because I wanted you to read it and we could monologue about it, or monologue about it. So the enjoyment is mutual. Thank you.
Well, I'll look forward to when we get to do this again. Is there something you're working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah. So I have a few things that are coming out. One of the bigger projects that I'm working on, though, is a really fun project. So through the Ellul Society, I got connected with Ellul's grandson, and all of Ellul's surviving kids have been really good to carry on his legacy. I mean, the guy wrote so much. There's still unpublished material and like archives that need to be sorted through. And one of the things that was discovered was a bunch of manuscripts that were lecture notes for a film club that he started after the war. So he had this film club where students and anybody who was interested could come and watch like pre and post-war European and American film and analyze them according to like an Ellulian hermeneutic, right? So themes of technology, themes of violence, themes of revolution, themes of propaganda in like landmark 20th century films, right? Like Diary of a Country Priest and Days of Wrath and like Italian neorealist, French New Wave films. So I've was part of a team of people, Kelsey Haskett, who I've worked before. She translates, and someone who's a colleague here who works in this area of European post-war film, Ned Zankovic. We're transcribing the notes, translating the notes, and then going to do essays on these films. So it's going to be a good amount of work, but it's going to be fun because it's an excuse to watch all of these films and then figure out what Ellul thought about them. So that's what I'm working on right now. Yeah, that's probably the thing that comes to mind.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you have to let me know when it exists for other people's enjoyment, because
Sure. I will too.
and
I will
also
too.
that sets up for a fun class to teach, because
Yeah.
you can just show the films and there's
yeah.
a higher success rate on finishing assigned films versus assigned text.
Especially these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for your time.
All righty. Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the episode. Well, you know what that means? That means you're awesome. You and all the cool kids do like yourself, they share the brew, because the best brew is a shared brew, so share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. If you love it, if you dig it, or if you go, whoa, I got a question I'd like to engage, then you should head over to the Substack. That is the easiest place to interact, reflect, connect, meet other people, send me your questions and feedback. And also, if you love it and you want to make it possible, then go to homebrewcommunity.com And you can find the ways to support the podcast, connect with community, and get access to over 45 plus classes we've done over the years. If you want to hang out in person, then come to Theology Beer Camp. October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. TheologyBeer.camp. That's the URL. Come on out and nerd out with your geek out in the flesh.